Please welcome Dr. Jon Chorover.
Thank you, Shipper, and thanks everybody for coming and hanging on with the rain. It's a beautiful night in Tucson to do this, and as long as the rain holds out, we'll all be good. It's a pleasure really to be the one to introduce the concept of the critical zone to you all. I know the next 4 lectures in this series are going to be also on critical zone science, and those are going to be given by folks that are working with us on the Critical Zone Observatory. But let's jump right in and address the fact that we live on a rocky planet that also is bathed in water and air. And in fact, it's that rocky matrix and the water and the atmosphere that makes it possible to live here. This is one of the few planets of its type that we know of, especially in this part of the universe. And that's the only one we know of that at this point in time that has life that exists on the planet. You can see that life sort of stretching across the planet in this green color. And when we think about that life that exists on the surface of the planet, it's really restricted to a very thin veneer on the very surface of the planet. If you think about the fact that the depth to the center of the Earth is about 6,370 kilometers, and the continental crust at the surface of the Earth is about 35 to 40 kilometers, so that's about 0.5% of the total distance down into the center of the planet. That's a really small, thin veneer. The critical zone is an even thinner part of that veneer. It's only on the order of tens to hundreds of meters thick. So the critical zone is in fact a layer or a thin veneer that's also, in this case, about 0.5% of the total depth of the continental crust. So it's really small fraction of the total Earth where all of the life as we know it exists. Right at that interface between the atmosphere and the lithosphere. And in fact, the critical zone, which is a term that was defined in 2001 by the National Academy of Sciences, defines a zone as extending from the upper or outer periphery of the vegetation canopy down to the bottom of the groundwater table. So you can see here, there's a bottom or lower limit of the groundwater table below which is impermeable rock and below which groundwater no longer extends. So this is a relatively thin part of the Earth's surface where all of the life that we know, plants and animals and microorganisms exist and do the work and functioning of the biosphere and make our planet habitable for life and certainly for humans as well. So here's another example image of the critical zone showing that it extends from sort of the lower limit of the atmospheric boundary down to the bottom of freely circulating groundwater. And at the lower limit, the lower end of the critical zone is bounded by impermeable bedrock. And so who studies the critical zone and what kind of science do they do? Several types of scientists study the critical zone, including atmospheric scientists who are interested in the role that precipitation may play, and land-atmosphere exchange may play in generating rainfall onto the surface of the Earth. Hydrologists study essentially the circulatory system of the critical zone and the migration of water in this near-surface environment. Ecologists are interested in the assembly of vegetation on the surface of the Earth and also the distribution of microorganisms throughout the depth of the critical zone. Soil scientists and geologists focus really on this lower part of the critical zone, particularly where bedrock converts into this life-sustaining porous medium that we call soil that allows plants to grow. And so it takes, you've heard the term, it takes a village to raise a child. Essentially, it takes a village to study the critical zone because it's a complex environment that contains multiple components of Earth's surface system behavior. And fortunately, here at the U of A, we have departments in each of these different areas. So we have remarkable breadth and depth in the area of critical zone science, and much of that is incorporated in this School of Earth and Environmental Sciences that contains departments of atmospheric and hydrologic sciences, ecology, soil science, and geosciences as well. So it makes it a great place to do the kind of integrated work that's needed to understand these complicated Earth surface systems. But why is the zone termed critical? That's a reasonable question. It sounds like a pretty strong term for any particular zone in the Earth system. But arguably it's critical because it supports all life on Earth, which makes it a fairly important or critical component of the Earth system. But let me give you some examples as well. Just a few examples as we get started. So, one of the most important functions of the critical zone is that it sustains ecosystem development and growth. So here's a healthy ecosystem, obviously in a relatively high rainfall environment. It's very rich in terms of leaf area. And these plants that are present in this forest system are taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, drawing down that CO2, and reacting it with water that they're taking from below ground, obtaining that water from their root systems. And as a result of that reaction, which is called photosynthesis because it's catalyzed by sunlight, they're able to produce reduced carbon or biomass, like this tree trunk right here, or all this vegetation on the surface. This is reduced carbon molecules that have been reduced from CO2. And a product of that reaction as well, in addition to that reduced carbon, is oxygen, that we're all thankful for because we breathe that oxygen, as do other organisms that are heterotrophs, so that essentially eat this type of carbon to live. So the functioning of these ecosystems is essential to producing many of the products that we depend on, including agricultural products, of course. But in addition to the sources of gases like CO2 and the source of water from the subsurface environment, the weathering of rock is a critical component. So it's not just atmospheric sources that allow ecosystems to grow, but it's also the weathering of rock and the production of soil, because it's from these constituents and these components that we all get, all living organisms, including plants, humans, get mineral nutrients like calcium, magnesium, potassium, iron, zinc, and phosphorus. So all of these types of mineral nutrients, which are essential to growth as well, derive from a completely different part of the Earth system that interfaces with the atmosphere at the critical zone. So it's a fortunate fact that rocks are sort of in contact with the air at this location. Soils can also be, or sort of the porous geological media that is soil and regolith, which is the entire weathering profile in the critical zone, can be thought of as a living filter on the planet. One way to think of it is that it is a filter. It has a lot of porosity and a lot of surface area that removes contaminants from water that's flowing through it. So as a human society, we generate a lot of contaminants that are released into the atmosphere and released into water. One of the benefits of the critical zone and services that it plays in respect to society is that it removes many of these contaminants during water transport, essentially purifies the water. Think of a septic leach field, for example, as a purification mechanism where the water that's released into this leach field is unclean, wastewater. Sorry about the dinner time reference to septic systems, but it cleans the soil system, essentially cleans up that water and removes those contaminants from during its transport through the soil. So one other example of how the critical zone plays a major role in the habitability of the planet is in its climate regulation capacity. It helps to regulate climate. We're all aware of the fact that human activities is increasing the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere because of the burning of fossil fuels, and that this is having an impact on global climate change and temperature increases across the globe. At the same time, the critical zone has always functioned in a way to draw down CO2 from the atmosphere by way of photosynthesis. And so there's an accumulation of carbon in biomass, and then after that carbon is released from trees through litter fall or senescence or trees die, that organic carbon can be sequestered into the porous weathering medium that is soils and regolith. And you'll notice here that in fact a huge amount of carbon at the Earth's surface is stored in this subsurface environment that we call regolith or soil. In fact, 1,500 petagrams, or 10 to the 15th grams, is sequestered in soils and stabilized by interactions with minerals, protected from degradation. And the amount of carbon there is actually more than the amount in all of the plant biomass on the planet, plus all the amount of carbon in the atmosphere combined. So it's a huge pool that's sort of just sitting there just below the surface that if it were to be released to the atmosphere would actually have catastrophic consequences for life on the planet. So things that we do on the planet in terms of land use change that can affect the release of this big soil carbon pool could have significant implications as well. So it's for all these reasons, the fact that there is sort of a diversity of disciplinary areas that need to be combined to study the critical zone, and that the critical zone is so important to habitability of the planet, that the National Science Foundation developed this network of critical zone observatories in 2009 that Shepard referred to early on. And these observatories are located across the United States. One of these observatories is located in our backyard here in Tucson, and it's in the Catalina Mountains, so just north of town here. And also it's located in the Jemez River Basin, which is in northern New Mexico, just north of Albuquerque. So it's considered one observatory because it's the same group of us that are doing studies at both locations and utilizing this larger elevation gradient that we have because of these two locations. But other sites are obviously located throughout the country in different regions of the country, and both different geological settings and climatic settings. So what are some of the science questions the critical zone observatories are asking? And they're relatively simple questions with pretty complicated answers, but what is the structure of the critical zone? So what is the nature of the architecture, if you will, of the critical zone, extending from the plant architecture and the way plants assemble on the surface of the planet down through the soil and weathering regolith? How does geochemical changes, how do these geochemical changes occur throughout that depth? What is the structure of biological communities in the subsurface, including microbial communities? What's the nature of hydrologic flow paths there that deliver water from precipitation to streams or groundwater, etc.? So that's really what we're talking about when we talk about structure. It's how that weathering profile. What does it look like? Most of it's out of sight. It's below ground. We don't really see it most of the time when we're walking around in the above ground part of the critical zone. How does it function refers to how does it process chemicals? How does it process water? What's the nature of the biological activity there? How does it sequester carbon from the atmosphere? How does it release carbon back to the atmosphere, etc.? That's sort of how it functions. And there's geochemical functions and biological functions and hydrologic functions. How does it evolve over long time scales? This is a question that all of us are seeking to ask across the network. We're all studying the critical zone at a given snapshot in time. We go out to a given site. That site has been developing over millions of years in many cases. And so we're out here for a relatively short period of time during which we have the funding to do so from the National Science Foundation. So it's really just a snapshot in the overall time of the evolution of the critical zone. So we tend to utilize models and modeling approaches to figure out how the relationships between function and structure teach us about the evolution of the critical zone over long time scales. So probably the primary driver of critical zone architecture is water. And so we should, I guess, be grateful for the fact that we had a little bit of that delivery today in precipitation. But the United States and where these critical zone observatories are located is very heterogeneous with respect to water availability. As we know, the eastern part of the country is pretty rich in water, relatively high annual precipitations. This is the map of annual precipitation across the United States. Whereas the west coast and the hotter, redder colors are lower precipitation rates. We tend to receive much less water, although the amount of water we do receive tends to be very heterogeneously distributed, much higher in mountain systems, for example, than in the basins. And so with the Catalina Jemez CZO, we're located at the hotter, drier end of this overall spectrum in terms of climate relative to the rest of the critical zone observatories. And so it's for that reason that when we look at the landscape that surrounds us here in the Sonoran Desert, we see a relatively sparse vegetation. We see a lot of bare soil. The plants are pretty highly distributed, and there's not nearly that canopy cover that we saw on the earlier slide. But that's because of the low rainfall and the low soil development or weathering of the rock that gives rise to a lower water holding capacity of the soil. But we're really blessed here as well in terms of the Critical Zone Observatory because we have these sky islands that surround the Tucson Basin, including the Santa Catalina Mountains. And so the Santa Catalina Mountains as being one of our primary natural laboratories, we know that they extend across a variety of ecosystem types because with elevation, there's a significant gradient in climate as well. So the mean annual temperature down here in Tucson is 65 degrees Fahrenheit. We receive 40 centimeters of rain. But if you go to the top of Mount Lemmon, mean annual temperature is quite a bit lower at 50 degrees C, and they receive up there double the amount of rain. So yesterday's storm, we got about an inch down here. They got 4 inches up on Mount Lemmon. And so when we get rain here, they're getting more of it up there. And we're thankful for that because that rain is what recharges in part the Tucson Basin aquifer where we get our drinking water, rain and snow, I should say. And as we go up in elevation, we therefore get this big change in vegetation types from the Sonoran Desert to grassland ecosystems to pinyon juniper to ponderosa pine and finally to mixed conifer forest. And in association with that, we get this significant increase in the biomass. And associated with that as well, a deepening of the soils and an enrichment of the soils in more carbon and more carbon storage, really driven by the fact that there's a higher water availability at these higher elevations. So what does it mean to have an observatory or a critical zone observatory in general? And what does it mean to observe the critical zone? So since the critical zone extends from the outer periphery of the vegetation canopy down to the bottom of groundwater, that's a lot of real estate to cover. And so a critical zone observatory has instrumentation that's located across that vertical transect that goes from the top of the vegetation canopy, such as this eddy covariance or flux tower at the top of Mount Bigelow in the Catalinas, which stands up well above the canopy of the trees and can measure land-atmosphere exchange of carbon dioxide and water. And then we're measuring as well water fluxes in the trees and vegetation in these sites, gas fluxes throughout the depth of the soils and up into the atmosphere, vice versa. We measure soil moisture and temperature as a function of depth. We're collecting samples as a function of depth and bring them back to the lab and do mineralogy and geochemistry analyses and microbial analyses to get a sense of how the geochemistry relates to what types of microorganisms are present and what they might be doing in terms of developing this weathering profile. And then we measure properties all the way down to deeper groundwater environments and have wells, also flumes that measure surface water discharges, hydrologic response of our catchments and hydrochemical responses, and try to understand how precipitation events are translated into surface water chemistry and dynamics. So you can think of this as an open system study that we're conducting in the critical zone where we're looking at inputs to the critical zone and sort of looking at that from the top boundary what happens in terms of fluxes into the critical zone and out of the critical zone at that top boundary. And principal constituents of interest to us include water and CO2 in particular. But we're also interested in human activities on the landscape that can affect changes in those fluxes, including anthropogenic changes in the landscape, but also fire-induced or other disturbance-induced changes have become very important. We then examine how those climatic inputs affect structural changes within the critical zone in terms of plant and microbial colonization, so biological activities, mineral weathering, or geochemical activities in the critical zone, the development of regolith depth, the depth of the weathering profile, and water flow paths. Because this structuring that occurs internally then affects the relationship between inputs and outputs in terms of stream discharges and water delivery that we get from different landscape locations. We're highly dependent on the mountain landscapes in Arizona and Colorado for our water. So we're very interested in what are the processes in particular happening in those montane landscapes that affect the transmission of water to places where it's used by society. So those outputs we're measuring from the critical zone include water, solutes, sediments, and gases, because it informs us on what's going on internally. So I want to just give you a few examples, going back again to the types of data, to show you some examples of some data that we get from these different places where we're studying the critical zone. So here's an example where we're looking at the inputs into the critical zone of precipitation. That's in the blue bars. This is for our Jemez Mountains mixed conifer site. So precipitation is in the blue bars, and precipitation functions really on an annual basis. You can see these annual pulses in air temperature, highest air temperatures being in July, lowest air temperatures being in the winter. We have a bimodal distribution pattern where we get summer monsoon rains like, well, I guess this wasn't really officially a monsoon-like rain, maybe it was. And then winter snow precipitation at high elevation. And winter rains here in the Tucson Basin. And so you can see that there is this bimodal distribution of precipitation that's superimposed with temperature. And it's that water availability and temperature that's controlling ecosystem responses in terms of carbon dioxide exchange between the critical zone and the atmosphere. And what we see is that we have two kinds of bars. The ones on the top are gross primary production or photosynthesis, basically carbon dioxide drawdown from the atmosphere and the building of new tree biomass or plant biomass. And then we have ecosystem respiration on the bottom, which is the release of that carbon back to the atmosphere upon decomposition or respiration, just activities in the biota. And so what we can see is that primary production in this site significantly exceeds respiration. So this particular site is a net sink of carbon. It's a net draw of carbon from the atmosphere, and it's sequestering carbon in a variety of forms within the critical zone, including biomass and these soil forms that are so important, as we talked about earlier. Interestingly, we had a wildfire hit this site in June of 2013, and it completely wiped out all of the vegetation in this place where we were working, left it as a charred landscape, moonscape. And that inverted in the subsequent year the fact that this was no longer a sink. This particular environment became a source of carbon to the atmosphere as that vegetation that had been killed continued to decompose, and new vegetation has not yet been established there. So it'll be very interesting to follow this to see how long it takes for that ecosystem to recover to becoming a net carbon sink again. So I'm referring to this as breathing of the critical zone, but others have referred to it long before me as breathing of the biosphere. And it's essentially the type of fluctuations you see on an annual cycle with respect to carbon uptake and carbon release back to the atmosphere. We're also interested in understanding the subsurface structure of the critical zone. And that's done in a variety of ways. This is one way, pounding on the ground with a big sledgehammer. But in this case, what this person is pounding on is this metal plate, and that metal plate is attached to a bunch of geophones stretching out over the landscape and set into the ground so that one can understand the rate at which sonic waves or sound waves are going from the surface to depth. And by doing that, it's a method called seismic refraction. One can get information within a given catchment. So this is actually the Bigelow catchment that we're studying, right near that Bigelow Tower site that I showed you earlier. It's a small watershed that drains in this direction. It has a south-facing slope and a north-facing slope. And we ran transects in that Bigelow basin and made measurements of the depth of the regolith, or the depth of the weathering profile, which is difficult to see, to give some structural information on what's going on below ground to tens of meters in depth, down to about 50 meters in depth. And you can see that the north-facing slope has much shallower soils. This red color is what's called competent bedrock, or it's that impermeable bedrock boundary beyond which water doesn't travel. So relatively shallower soil. The soils really are shown in blue. The weathered bedrock and fractured bedrock is shown in yellow, and the competent bedrock, or non-fractured bedrock, is shown in red. And so there's a much shallower weathering profile on this slope of the catchment than on this slope of the catchment, which has a deeper weathering profile. And understanding the nature of that subsurface environment turns out to be really important in terms of interpreting the nature of outputs. And I'll just give you one example in that regard. So outputs from the critical zone include discharges from springs or discharges from rivers. And we're making those measurements of those types of discharges in a variety of catchments. So you can think of catchments then, particularly in light of this picture I showed you earlier about the depth of this weathering profile, behaves sort of like a sponge. When water rains on that catchment, the sponge soaks up the water, and the water is retained within the pore spaces. The next time it rains, the water that's being held in those pore spaces is then discharged into streams or rivers and released, and the new water that has come in replaces it and sits there in the sponge, right? So one of the things we're learning is that different locations of this sponge contribute differentially to discharges and catchments. And there's a relationship in terms of the concentration of rock-derived elements like cations, magnesium, potassium, etc., that come from the weathering of rock, and the flow path length that water has traveled. So the longer the flow path length, the longer the distance the water's traveled through a catchment, the higher the concentration of solutes deriving from the rock weathering is. It makes sense, right? As the water travels through the rock, it's picking up solutes weathering the rock. The longer the travel path is, the more solutes are going to show up in the water. What's going on inside the soil or the regolith at that period of time is also very important, and we study that by taking a close look at these weathering products that are in the soil or regolith. So when rock minerals like this feldspar weather, they tend to accumulate on their surfaces. This is the transmission electron micrograph, so very small spatial scale of 50 micrometers. They tend to accumulate on their surfaces weathering products that are very highly porous and reactive. Here's another nice example. These are what are called biotite books. Biotite is a mineral that's in the Catalina mountains. You can see it when you're walking along the trail. Sometimes you see a sort of aluminum foil looking mineral that's on the trail. You think, oh, somebody left aluminum foil here, but you pick it up. It's actually a mineral. It's called biotite. And it comes in these books. These are called biotite books because they look like the frayed edges of a book. When you look closely at those biotite books, which come from the granite itself, you see that they are coated with secondary minerals that come from soil weathering and from the passage of that water through the rock that releases silicon and aluminum into solution, and it reprecipitates on the surface as this very fluffy looking, very high surface area material. That material is very important to the functioning of these soils because this is where that organic carbon tends to get sequestered and stabilized against degradation. It's also the types of surfaces that purify the water that passes through the critical zone. And so these microscopic images give you some understanding then of precisely what's going on in these weathering environments that contribute some of these services, if you will, to society. We should be grateful for the fact that weathering is happening in our backyard. When we have these types of weathering profiles form, we tend to see this porous material, which gives the water holding capacity and sustains the vegetation above it, as shown here. And that really that couldn't be sustained by the rock material itself. It's this weathering process in the critical zone that gives rise to the capacity to sustain an ecosystem and allow it to grow in terms of its vegetation and biomass. So I hope this sort of brief introduction to the critical zone got you interested in it, and we can talk about and have some questions now as well. But I want to highlight the fact that over the next 4 months, or 3 months, I guess, there are going to be 3 other talks on the critical zone, more specific, getting into microbial activities in the critical zone, soil development processes, and water transport through the critical zone by 3 different speakers that are involved in our critical zone observatory. Those 3, here are all the faculty that are actually at the U of A across those departments I mentioned that are involved in our CZO project. The folks that you'll hear from in the coming months are Tom Meixner on water, Craig Rasmussen on soil development, and Rachel Gallery on microbial dynamics. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions y'all have.
All right, thank you so much. It is fascinating science, and those of you, many of you I recognize, and you've been here before, so you know that if you raise your hand, I'll bring you the microphone to ask a question, and I'll bring the microphone around in the order that I see the hands go up. I've seen 2 hands go up already, 3 hands go up already. I'll be there soon. 4 hands go up already.